Good morning. My name is Bevis Longstreth. I'm a trustee of the New School University, and I'm pleased to be here. I wish, seems to me 10 o'clock was a decent hour to start, but we don't have as many people here as I think this panel deserves. I hope they'll be coming in as we go through the discussion. It's a great panel, and it's worthy of a timeless topic, money in politics. And I'm very pleased to be the moderator. For those in the audience around my vintage, one sees those words, money in politics, and you start kind of humming or singing, as perhaps you recall Frank Sinatra or Diana Shore or Peggy Lee doing in the 1950s, love and marriage, go together like a horse and carriage. Well, that's just so 50s. Today, in many, many states, love and marriage can't go together like a horse and carriage. And in New York City, under our new mayor, even that metaphor is endangered because the mayor is trying to carry out his campaign pledge to part the horse from the carriage. On the other hand, money in politics have never been tighter thanks to the Supreme Court's rulings in Citizens United and McCutcheon. With the power to declare black as white, one can accomplish a lot. The court ruled that money is speech, and that's all it took. Actually, it's all it took because it had already ruled that corporations are people, despite corporations having infinite life and limited liability, which are things that we humans don't enjoy. So in McCutcheon, Chief Justice Roberts began with this, and I quote, "There is no right more basic in a democracy than to pick one's elected officials," close quote. But the case wasn't about whether individuals can pick their own congressman, as Mr. Justice Stevens recently observed. Stevens said, in what really is a blinding insight, quote, "This case is about giving lots of campaign contributions to pick other people's congressmen, not your own." So arms linked tightly and friendly, money and politics have the wind at their backs in defining our country's public interest. How this phenomenon affects policy addressing climate change is the topic for this panel. Each panelist will have 20 minutes to speak. We'll hold all questions until the four panelists have spoken, and then if you'll make your way to these microphones, and sitting is fine in a line if you get tired of standing, we'll take the questions one by one, and please identify yourself before you ask a question, and let's make sure it's a question and not some kind of statement or speech. So we're going to begin with Robert Inglis, who, and I'm going to introduce these panelists as they come up. So Bob is Executive Director of the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, which is based in George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. He founded and launched this national grassroots organization on July 10th, 2012. And this initiative, well, it is conservative, and this initiative is guided by conservative principles of free enterprise and economic growth, limited government, liberty, accountability, and reasonable risk avoidance to solve our nation's energy and climate challenges. Under Bob's leadership, the initiative advocates conservative alternatives to big government mandates and fickle tax incentives. And it maintains that the accountability of a true cost comparison between competing fuels will drive innovation and economic growth. He's an optimistic conservative, and he launched this initiative to apply a can-do American spirit to the challenges at hand. And we wish him luck, and we're very proud. The New School has this left-wing reputation. I mean, here our first speaker has a kind of a conservative bent. Now, what I read sounds a little bit like a campaign brochure, and there's a reason for that, because Bob served 12 years as a congressman from South Carolina. And it's important to note that he served 6 years, and then honoring a pledge, he resigned. And then later, he came back by critical acclaim to serve another 6 years. And therefore, he was pulling what historians would call a Grover Cleveland. In 2011, he spent the spring semester as a resident fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University, and he taught at Duke University in the spring of 2012. Please join me in welcoming Bob Inglis.
Thanks, Bevis. Yes, sort of conservative fellow, as Bevis just said. You know, you've got to assume that anybody speaking about climate change must be some kind of mushy moderate, right? I mean, if they're a Republican, must be a mushy moderate. But let me just give you some numbers. 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA. Microphone not working? And 0 with the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO. I really wanted a 0. And I'd like to have a recount on that last one. If anybody can hook me up with the AFL-CIO so I can get that recounted to a 0, I'd be very appreciative. So pretty conservative fellow, right? For the first 6 years in Congress, as Bevis told you, I was there, elected in '92. I said that climate change was hooey. Al Gore's imagination. Had a great press conference one time making fun of Al Gore. And that went on for my first 6 years. That was Inglis 1.0, as we call it. Then I was out 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina. And I was running again for Congress in 2004. My son, our oldest of 5 kids, came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed, his mother agreed. So I had this new constituency, all of whom could change the locks on the doors. So very important to respond to constituencies like that. That was the first step of my metamorphosis. Second was getting on science committee, going to Antarctica, seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings of an increase in CO2 coinciding with the Industrial Revolution. And then third step was really something of a spiritual epiphany. Checking out coral bleaching at the Great Barrier Reef, snorkeling with an Aussie climate scientist who, as he'd show me things, I could tell in his voice and in his face and in the way that in his eyes that he was worshiping God in the creation, not worshiping the creation, and that we shared a worldview. Afterwards, we had an opportunity to share words and came to understand that we did, in fact, share a worldview. And he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life in order to love God and love people. And so for me, it was rather inspiring. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in the midst of Great Recession. It will not go well in perhaps the reddest district in the reddest state of the nation. But I was voting against cap and trade because I think it's hopelessly complicated, embarrassing in the free allocations for the well-connected, that it decimated American manufacturing, and a massive tax increase. So for all those reasons, I voted against cap and trade. But I figured that, if you're going to oppose, you need to propose something. So I proposed the alternative, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And we can get into that if you want to, about what that solution looks like. That's what we live to do with the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, is since I got tossed out for that heresy, along with some others, like being for comprehensive immigration reform, voting against the troop surge out of conservative concerns. I was concerned that George Bush was doing nation building in Iraq. And voting for TARP, which will never be forgiven by the Tea Party, I suppose. But for those heresies, but the most enduring was just saying that climate change is real and let's do something about it. Because it was an offense against a tribal orthodoxy. And so the important question of your conference here is the climate demands action. Why aren't we acting? So I'd like to suggest two reasons. First, and then discuss money and politics as well. First, is conservatives have yet to hear a solution that's consistent with their values. What they keep hearing about is something like resuscitating cap and trade. But I'm here to tell you that cap and trade is graveyard dead. That would require a resurrection, not a resuscitation, and that is a larger miracle. They keep hearing, though, people talking about capping, which means regulations, trading, which means the well-connected are going to get some sort of deal out of their lobbyist in Washington. And they reject it. And besides that, they say, sounds like an increase in the size of government. So when you're confronted with a solution that doesn't fit your values, what do? You go back and you doubt whether there's a problem. So for example, if I told you, here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to remove your head. Then once you've got your head off, we're going to work on your spine. Then we put your head back on. Thanks, Doc, my back is a lot better now. I just don't think I've got a problem anymore. So what I hope you don't underestimate is when conservatives hear many talking about climate change, what they're hearing is a solution that is anathema, a bigger government that taxes more, regulates more, increases the size of the nanny state, takes away liberty. These things do violence to conservative principles. So they have yet to hear a solution that fits with their values. That's the first reason that we're not acting, I think. The second reason we're not acting, and this is going to get close perhaps here, is the theological rigidity of the environmental left. And it is theological rigidity. There's this insistence in the environmental left of a certain perceived path forward. And really, it's theological. So for example, if you're a creationist, you're not welcome. If you believe in intelligent design, you're not welcome. If you believe in anything other than godless evolution, you're not acceptable on the environmental left. And so, somebody showed me a chart recently showing the polarization of America in environmental matters. And what's interesting, and for the social scientist here, I hope you pick up on this immediately, is the way of measuring that was chosen was ratings by environmental organizations of members of Congress. Well, now, I don't know, I hope the person that did that study isn't in the room, because I would tell you, think about your metric. Do you think there might have been a spurious variable there? Perhaps the rating organizations were changing the ratings. And this now gets right into money and politics. Because assume here today that we're going to be talking about the Koch brothers and all their money, right? And that is true. Let me just speak to that for a moment. The people who spent a lot of money in the Great Recession spent it very well. Because basically what was happening here is the tide was in on distrust of organizations and institutions. The church had long ago failed us, government has failed us, but in the Great Recession, institutions of banking had failed us. So in that environment, there was this enormous distrust of institutions, and the tide was in on that. And so what some people with some money did is they spent some very well-timed money to basically whip up a wave on top of that very high tide of distrust. And they basically started to doubt scientists and threw them in with the government and this whole sort of setup where these people that do this research get grants, and the result is they report back to their government overlords what the overlords want to hear, and they sold that message in this whipped up wave right on top of that high tide. The wave came over the seawall and shorted out all the equipment on action on energy and climate. And really, you can see it in my measuring life in politics. When I ran again in 2004, the beginning of Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version, is what we tried to sell it as, the district, the reddest district and the reddest state in the nation, really, I think it is. It's Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's a wonderful conservative district. They basically said to me, Republican primary electorate in 2004, okay, Inglis, sounds a little bit strange that you're focused on this energy thing, but go ahead. The economy's all right. In fact, it's pretty good. So we'll live with it. Here's 85% of the primary electorate that's voting for you. So he won that primary with 85% of the vote. 06 is still all right. 08, thank goodness the Republican primary was in June, not later in the year. Because as the Great Recession came on, it became difficult. 10, we knew that cycle would be difficult, and sure enough it was. I got only 29% of the vote in the Republican primary in June of 2010 because of these heresies, but the most enduring, as I said, was just saying climate change is real. So I can testify to the result of that money and how it was spent very well and how it came over the seawall and shorted out the equipment. But I would suggest to you, if you're going to describe that as the sole reason for why we are where we are with this polarization on climate, then I would say to you that you're really missing it. Because the reality is campaign money can only whip up a wave on top of whatever the tide is. So for example, if you're running for Congress in the 1970s, you could make your campaign in Greenville-Spartanburg, South Carolina about the protection of Taiwan. Really, you could have run a campaign all about that. The tide was in on the Red Scare and communism and all that and the Cold War, and you could have won a congressional primary in South Carolina and a lot of other places on the issue of Taiwan. If you're thinking about running for Congress in 2014, I'd suggest to you that Taiwan is not a real good issue in any district that I can think of, because it is dead low tide on that issue, right? And so no matter how much money you spend, you can't get over the seawall because the tide is just out. But the tide was in on distrust of government. The tide was in on reaction to the Great Recession. And so some folks spent some well-timed money. Now, what it's up to us to do is to bail out the equipment that they shorted out and start rewiring, right? That's what we're trying to do with the Energy Enterprise Initiative. But we're used to the attack on the right about that. But let me just suggest that, particularly since I sense that I may be among some of the environmental left, that really those ratings depict something. You know, a lot of criticism by my friend Jim DeMent running the Heritage Foundation that their fundraising imperative causes them to send out right-wing letters that cause the mamas and the papas to write off checks on the kitchen table for $25, $35, and that the letters get more and more screaming. But I would suggest to you that it's the same on the environmental left. If you look at my ratings, I think I failed every environmental rating that exists. Even Republicans for Environmental Protection, I think I had an F. If you look at NRDC, I'm pretty sure it's a 0 the entire time I was in Congress. So what is the imperative of those groups? The imperative of those groups is to send out a letter just like Jim DeMint's letter, except the opposite. Basically says, the whole world is ending, apocalypse is upon us, and it will happen to us unless you send us $35, and we will save you from the apocalypse. And so the mamas and the papas in liberal households write off those $35 checks. The organization gets a big sum of money, and now what do they do with their ratings? What do they score? The things they've got to score in order to feed that constituency, in order to keep them writing those $35 checks. Because if you shut down the $35 checks, and the folks at the top don't have a job, nor do all the people in the middle or in the bottom of those organizations. So that money drives the divide in America, the polarization. And so whoever did that study, that chose that as the measuring device, they really need to go look at the study. Look at the measuring device and see if I'm correct that the environmental left chose more and more extreme positions to rate members of Congress on, because they had to feed that constituency in order to get those $35 checks. And so it's not, for those that want to put the right under the microscope and figure out what went wrong here, let's hand wring a little bit and say, oh my, the Koch brothers, oh my, the environmental right, the right wing, they have done it to us. Perhaps that microscope that we have on the right, we should turn around, the lens around, and look at the environmental left and say, did the environmental left move left? And I think the pretty clear answer is yes. Because when you go around speaking as though humans are an invasive species that isn't supposed to be here, what reaction do you expect out of conservative audiences? What do you expect out of people who believe in God? What do you expect them to do? Of course they're going to react negatively. Of course they're going to say, you're not for me, you don't like me, and therefore I don't want to hear anything you got to say about climate change. So what we have to do at places like the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, and it is a very new effort, is create something of an environmental right. Be able to say, you know what? There are solutions. They don't involve regulations. In fact, if we want to solve climate change, one of the keys may be to shrink the size of the EPA and repeal some Clean Air Act regulations after we price carbon dioxide. Because if you can go to conservatives and say, here's the deal, we'll price carbon. It really matters to us on the environmental left to price carbon. You, environmental right, you choose the corresponding tax cuts. I was with a group that took to sit at the feet of Kevin Hassett. He's a conservative economist in Washington. It had a small group of people, had some progressives, some conservatives. Kevin Hassett said to them, okay, so everybody here wants to price carbon dioxide. He said, good. I do too. He said, so I got a deal for you. We'll price carbon dioxide, and I, Kevin Hassett, get to choose the corresponding tax cuts. Deal? A couple of progressives started shaking their head, no. He said, why not? They said to him, because you'll choose the corporate income tax to reduce. He said, that's precisely what I would do. He said, so it's a real gut check for you, isn't it? How important is climate change? If you think it's the existential threat that you say it is, you will let me cut the corporate income tax. That would change things. So rather than President Obama standing at the State of the Union saying, it is a fact, he was not doing substantive work on climate change at that moment. What he was doing was congressional midterm electioneering. He was trying to gin up his base to overcome Obamacare, the reaction to Obamacare. That's what he was doing in that speech. If he had been doing substantive climate change work, this is what he would have said. He could have gestured to his right, where most Democrats sit in the State of the Union. He said, we want to price carbon dioxide. We want to deal with climate change. He could have gestured to his left and said, I understand that you, among conservatives, cannot abide the growth of government. So we'll supply the votes for pricing of carbon dioxide. You get to choose a corresponding tax cut. And then he could turn to John Boehner and say, deal, John? Then we could have busted this thing loose. Then we could have been in business. But I would suggest to you, it's not just the right that has moved right. It's the environmental left has moved left. And there are financial imperatives involved in both movements. That's why we're so divided in America on climate change. Thank you.
So our next speaker, and that's so provocative, I'm tempted to ask a question right now, but I'll hold it. Our next speaker is Robert Mendelsohn, who is the Edwin Weyerhaeuser Davis Professor of Forest Policy, Professor of Economics, Professor at the School of Management at Yale University. He's written over 100 peer-reviewed articles and edited 6 books, including, especially important for this discussion, Climate Change in Agriculture, an economic analysis of global impacts, adaptation, and distributional effects in 2009. The focus of Robert Mendelsohn's research has been the valuation of the environment. He has developed methods to value natural ecosystems, including coral reefs, old-growth forests, non-timber forest products, ecotourism, and outdoor recreation. And he's also developed methods to value pollution, the other side of the coin, including emissions, particulates, and sulfur dioxide and hazardous waste sites. His most recent work values the impacts of greenhouse gases, including the effects of climate change on agriculture, forests, water resources, energy, and coasts. The research carefully integrates adaptation into impact assessment and has recently been extended to developing countries around the world. He has also been involved in studies of non-renewable resources, forest management, and specifically carbon sequestration in forests, the idea of making forest a carbon sink. So all of his work is precisely on the point of climate change and the issues it engages. And I'm really delighted to welcome him here to speak to you now.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. This is a great treat. And one of the things I guess I want to support is there's no question that climate change is an issue, and there's no question we're not doing very much about it. So just to reiterate the point of this conference, people who are very concerned about climate change, they want to see emissions cut by something like 80% by just in 40 years. But to date, we actually are mitigating less than 1% of what we're putting out there. In other words, we're doing nothing. So given that it's actually possible to reduce emissions, why aren't we doing it? So that's what we're here all for. So one of the reasons is it's got nothing to do with economics, it's got to do with political economy. And it's got to do with the fact that the atmosphere itself is a global commons, so it's owned by everybody in the planet. And if you reduce emissions, each country will have to pay for that. So this is a bill that will be sent to country. But the problem is the benefits of preventing things going into the global atmosphere is everybody will benefit from it. So if you look at it from a country perspective, you spend $1 and you get a penny back. You don't get very much back because you're sharing it with the rest of the planet. So this is a problem with the nature of a global commons, And it's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to organize mitigation. So if we had a global government, the global government would organize this, say, US, you'll pay this, Russia, you'll pay that, and we could probably organize this problem. But in the absence of a global government, this is an extremely difficult thing to actually coordinate across countries, because countries are not going to want to spend this money. They're going to want everybody else to spend the money. So that's just a fact about mitigation, and that's one of the primary reasons why mitigation itself is turning out to be difficult to accomplish. But what I'm here to talk about is actually not that. That's just a problem that's sitting in the background. I'm here to talk about the economics of this problem. That is, what do economists, when they're looking at climate change, what are they finding out? Well, economists like to weigh costs and benefits. That's a pretty straightforward idea. That's actually common sense, but they put a lot of math behind it, so it makes it look more powerful. What's one of the problems with this? Well, one of the problems with climate change is it's turning out to get rid of it is very expensive. If you want to get rid of it entirely, you're going to have to spend an awful lot of resources. So that's one of the reasons why we're not doing very much. The work I'm personally doing is on the benefit side, trying to measure what would happen. There's no question that lots of bad things are going to happen if the planet warms. But surprisingly, when you actually quantify those benefits, they're small compared to the costs. So they're modest. What else is a problem with climate change? Another problem with climate change is you have to start spending the money now. We have to start now. But the benefit of doing that is going to take a very long time to actually come around. There's lags in the ocean systems. There's lags in the economic systems. It's going to take a long time before those benefits actually show up. So this is another problem, because we don't really like to spend a lot of money today and get benefits way out in the future. If I tell you that the younger people in this audience, that you come work for me and I'll pay you when you retire. You say, what did you just say? You'll pay me when I retire? You know, I want to be paid today. I don't want to be paid when I'm retired. But that's the kind of problem we're facing with climate change. You're going to get paid way late in the future. And then it turns out there's one more problem. And the final problem is that the people who are doing most of the emissions, and therefore the people that have to spend most of the money on mitigation, are not the same people who are being damaged by climate change. The people who are going to be hurt the most are in the mid to high, the people who are going to pay most, mid to high latitude countries. The people who are going to be affected the most are in the low latitudes. That's where the damages of climate change are going to be concentrated. So you have a mismatch between who's going to pay and who gets the benefits. And that's also a big problem, especially when you think about the politics of this. So can we do it? Absolutely. If you talk to an engineer, they can find ways to reduce greenhouse gases. That's actually not the problem. There are ways to do it. Primarily, it's leaving fossil fuels in the ground. It's choosing not to burn them, but it's particularly choosing not to burn the ones that are laden with CO2. So that's be coal and synfuels and things like that. What else can you do? You can maybe get some technologies that can scrub the CO2 before it gets released to the atmosphere, and we can stuff it back underground. We're not sure we can do that really well, but at least that's a possibility that we might be able to do that. We can reduce our use of energy, because that's the source of the emissions. We can also use forests to store some of the carbon, so that's another way of fixing things. And then we've got a myriad of little things we could do. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. So we're going to have to do all these things. But the point is this can be done. It's not a question of whether it's impossible. It can be done. The problem is that if you push really hard and try to do a lot, it gets very expensive. So one of the things we know for sure, the more stringent our target, that is, the more we want to prevent climate change from happening, the less climate change we're going to allow, the more it's going to cost us, the bigger the sacrifice. And there is going to be a sacrifice, make no mistake about it. But even if you do it, even if you agree to do it, there's other parameters. If you design a program to control carbon dioxide, it's very important that it be efficient. Because if you do a wasteful program, you'll spend a lot of money and get nowhere with it. So what do you have to do to make sure it works? One of the things you have to do is every country has to participate. Not the terribly little poor countries, but all the countries that are doing substantial emissions. That's the OECD, but it's also all the emerging countries. in current life. That's China, it's India, it's Brazil. They have to be part of this as well. Okay, so that's first of all. And that's not obvious. We're going to get that kind of cooperation. Second, in every one of those countries, all the sources of emissions all have to participate. You can't say, well, you guys participate, you know, we'll really hit the consumers, we'll make it really tough to do transport, but we'll leave the coal plants alone, the power plants alone. No, you can't do that. Every source of emissions has got to be part of the program. And they all have to equate marginal cost. That is, they all have to do their share of trying to do something about emissions. And then the third thing you have to do is design a sophisticated program that matches the cost against what the damages are. And because the damages are in fact going to increase over time, that means the costs have to increase over time. So you have to commit to a dynamic program. And a dynamic program's complicated. And so it's got to be complicated. And you've got to make long-term promises. You've got to make promises that not only will we cut emissions today, but we promise we're going to cut emissions 30 years from now. So companies that invest into programs that are going to result in long-term emission reductions will actually get paid back for having made those long-term investments. We have an awful hard time making long-term commitments. You know, this Congress says we'll do it, the next Congress says, well, we're not going to do it. Next Congress says we'll do it again. That's not going to work. This has got to be a 100-year, 300-year program. It's got to be consistent. We have to be able to make long-term promises. So that's a serious problem. So what does it look like if we do this efficient cost curve? One of the things that you can see is that there's trade-off. If we want to hold warming to 2 degrees, there's a particular price. If we let it to be 3 degrees, there's a different price. If we allow it to be 4 degrees, it's a lower price. So one of the things that's important to understand is depending on what you want as your target, you're going to have to make different levels of sacrifice. Now, one of the things that's confusing about this sacrifice is when we talk about temperature changes, what are we talking about exactly? Are we talking about the temperature change tomorrow? Or are we talking about a temperature change 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now? So what I'm going to try to talk about is a temperature change in 200 years from now. So it's a kind of a long-term consequence. This is a design of how do you want to deal with this problem consistently over a very long time? And where do you want to end up? So we're going to focus on 2200. But remember, the temperature isn't going to get there tomorrow. It's going to gradually approach whatever we think of as our target. It's going to gradually approach that target by 2200. So this is actually a picture of what the trade-offs look like. So on the left-hand side, we've got the cost of these programs in trillions of dollars. And on the horizontal axis, what you've got is the long-term temperature you're going to end up with. So this is what you want the Earth to look like in 2200. And what it's saying is we could aim, so one of the questions you might have is, well, what about, why didn't I draw 1 degree? We are already at 1 degree. The planet has already warmed 1 degree. So that's where we are. So the next question is, well, how about 1 more degree? Well, it turns out if we want to hold things at 1 more degree, we're going to have to develop a program that's roughly worth $95 trillion today, in today's dollars. That's a program that's going to stretch out over 200 years, but that's what it's worth today. It's worth $95 trillion. It's hard to get the world to do a program that costs $95 trillion. If you said it was $95 billion, you have a shot. But this is not $95 billion. This is 1,000 times bigger than that. And we don't have anything that we're doing on a global scale that's anywhere close to this. So this is hard. So what happens if you say, well, let's loosen up a little bit? Maybe 2 degrees is too much. If you go to 3 degrees, it only costs 40 trillion. Now, 40 trillion is still a lot of money, but one of the things it's trying to get across, what this is getting across, is going from 3 to 2 is actually a very expensive step. You're going to have to spend an extra 50 trillion just to get that 1 degree removed. What happens if you go to 4 degrees? Well, that's only going to cost you 20 trillion. If you go to 5 degrees, it'll cost you 10. 6, it'll cost you 1. 7 is what's going to happen if we do nothing by 2200. That's where we're going. So this is giving you a sense not of what we should actually do. This is just telling you what your choices are. We can choose anywhere along this. These are the actual choices we have as a planet. We have to do this together, but this is what we've got as the best choice. So the question is, which one of these things should we choose? What should we target? What's our best choice? It depends on what our benefits are. What are we going to get if we spend money to go from 2 to 3 to 4, or go the other way, from 4 to 3 to 2? What do we get for that? So we know that climate change is going to cause damages to the economy. It's going to affect agriculture, it's going to affect energy, it's going to affect coasts, it's going to affect the water system, affect the timber market, it's going to have effects on ecosystems, there's going to be effects on productivity, biomass, there's going to be some small health risks, changes to our own health standing. We know that as you allow warming to increase, all those damages will get worse. And it's nonlinear. It'll get worse and worse. It's not just a little bit, every degree is the same price. It's going to get more harmful the more you allow to occur. The other thing we know is adaptation is going to be important as a way of reducing the damages. So one of the things that we're absolutely certain is that everybody in this room is going to adapt. You will adapt. You will definitely adapt. You will change your behavior. If the world gets a little warmer, you will change your behavior. People in Atlanta behave differently from people in New York with respect to the temperature. They've adapted to the fact that it's warmer in Atlanta. If you're in Miami, they've adapted to that. The kinds of changes that we're imagining are things the people already in the world have learned how to adapt to. You will learn how to adapt. So I'm confident that as individuals, you will do it. I'm also confident that firms will do it. Why will firms adapt? Because they'll make more money if they adapt. And that, believe it or not, motivates firms. They care about making money. So if making more money means they'll change, they're going to change. Farmers are going to adapt. Why would they do it? If they don't adapt, they're going to have no profits in the future. They're going to change. We already know farmers adapt very well to different climates. They've all done different things to live in different climates, to produce products in different climates. They will continue to do that in the future. They're definitely going to adapt. So adaptation turns out to be a very important thing to include when you're thinking about what's going to happen to us, because we are going to adapt. Now, not everything's a private adaptation. Some of the things that have to adapt are public. That is, they involve the government. The government's got to adapt. But the things that we expect the government to do now, the government runs conservation programs, they're going to have to run them differently to deal with a warmer world. The government's in charge of the coast, we might have to deal with the coast differently than we do with them now. There are some changes we need to make. But the idea is that even governments will do that because it will help their constituents, and they care about that. So what does it look like if we do actually adapt? What will happen to us as we change temperatures? What's happened to us as we've gone from 0 to 1 degree? Has the Earth come to an end? We are having a hard time identifying whether this has been good or bad. The net effects, if you look at the planet, across the planet, the net effects of going from 0 to 1, it's not very clear. It's not clear whether that was harmful or a little bit beneficial. It's unclear. What about going from 1 to 2? Well, we think from going from 1 to 2 is probably going to cause some small damages, mostly in the low latitudes. How big a damage is? About 0.5%. So 5%, I guess I should say, 5% of $1 trillion. So we're expecting it's going to be somewhere in the $50 billion range. That's what it's worth. What about going from 2 to 3? Then you're going to start talking about bigger damages. When you go from 2 to 3, there'll be a lot more things that you'll see. Well, that's clearly a damage. That's clearly a damage. That damage is getting more widespread. I'm starting to see this happening all over the place. That's when you're going to start seeing that there's a big payoff. But the problem when you go from 2 to 3, it turns out that doesn't happen until 2075, 2090. That doesn't happen for a very long time. So in terms of what that's worth today, it's not worth very much. So what is that worth to go to 3 degrees? $250 billion, $250 billion. And what about 4 degrees? Then you're starting to get up into half $500 billion or something a little bit higher. What's different about these benefits than the costs? They're a lot smaller. They're a lot smaller than the costs we just talked about. So if we compare the benefits to the cost, what's going on? Well, we haven't spent anything on climate change to date, and we haven't been damaged to date. So not much has happened at 1C. That's where we are today. But what about 2C? 2C, if we try to hold things at 2 degrees, the benefits are about 1% of the cost. Or to phrase it this way, the costs are 100 times the benefits. For every $100 you spend on costs, you should expect to get $1 back. That's the investment, what you're getting back. That's the rate of return on spending money to hit that target. So one of the things I'm arguing is that target is way too strict. You cannot justify that target. You're spending way too much money. You're not getting enough back. What about 3 degrees? Then it's only 10 times. So for every $100 you spend, you get $10 back. It's still not a very good investment, but it's starting to get better. What about 4 degrees? When you start to talk about 4 degrees, you're probably talking about something where you could argue the benefits are worth the costs. The extra benefit you're going to get to hold things at 4 degrees is worth it. So one of the things this is saying is perhaps we've gotten confused by getting too caught up in thinking 2C is the right target, and that we have to come up with $95 trillion, which the world is not going to do, and that's why we're not doing anything. But if we did 4 degrees, it turns out we can do 4 degrees. It's not that big a sacrifice. If we start today on 4 degrees, it's actually something that can happen, and we still will continue to get economic growth. People in the low latitudes won't have to stay poor. They can still grow. There's a lot of room for a solution at 4 degrees. It's something that you can actually imagine the world will actually do. And it's important we actually start doing something. You know, so don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that this is an unimportant problem. It is an important problem. But we've got to start talking about a target that we can actually reach. It's very important from a political point of view. We've got to start creating the institutions, the commitment to start actually doing something, not just talking about this. So that's where 4 degrees starts coming in. So what happens with 4 degrees? With 4 degrees, you go back to what Dr. Oppenheimer mentioned earlier. If we can hold it at 4 degrees, we can manage the worst possible things that are going to happen with climate change. You're going to avoid catastrophic events if we can hold things at 4 degrees. What does it mean? We'll mitigate for the worst, which is what 4 degrees is. Then we'll adapt for the rest. It's not that there won't be any damage associated with 4 degrees. There will be. But the idea is we can adapt to a lot of those changes. We'll take some hits on damages, but it will actually be something that we actually can do. So what's the other problem with this? Who pays the costs and who suffers the damages? It turns out they're not the same people. That turns out to generally be a problem. It's one thing for you to pay for yourself because you know you're going to benefit for something. But suppose the United States isn't going to get anything out of this. Suppose there's nothing going to happen to the United States for 100 years. We don't care. It doesn't matter whether we do anything on mitigation or not. But it turns out we do 25% of the emissions. So we might be expected to pay 25% of the cost. That's a huge target for us. It's a huge burden. Will we do that? Because we're rich and therefore will we do more than 25%? Well, it's unlikely we're going to do more than our share. And because of that, because the damages and the costs are not the same people, it's going to make it difficult to actually push forward with this. So this is, again, something that makes the political economy of this tricky. So this is a picture that gives you a sense of what I'm talking about with the low latitudes being hurt. That this picture evolves from the 2020 is way up there. There's hardly anything going on. But as you move forward through time, the climate progresses. But we're not quite sure how it will progress. So one model is the PCM model says, well, it'll progress, but it won't be so bad. And then the Hadley model says it'll progress and it'll be pretty bad. So these are two legitimate science models, all saying something. But they're actually saying something that's a slightly different message. The PCM model says, well, climate change is bad, especially for the people in the tropics, but you know, it's not bad for everybody else. So we're the ones that have to pay for this, so do we care? The Hadley model says, well, you know, even for us, it's going to be bad by 2100. So this is a different sort of scenario. But one of the things that's true about both these scenarios, and every climate model scenario, is that the low latitudes take the brunt of the damages. They may bear anywhere from 60 to 80% of the damages of climate change. This is not something that's spread evenly across everybody. That's not the way it's working out. The way this is looking is this is going to strike particular people in particular places. Now, that might not be the United States, but it turns out that's where most of the people in the world live. So this is where, I guess you'd say that this is where the problem is with climate change. There's a lot of people there, and they're the poorest people in the world. So what should we do then? So what I'm pressing is that we do start mitigation right away, but we start focusing on a target we actually will reach, something that we all could agree on. China can sign up for, India can sign up for, even Africa could sign up for this. The idea is start thinking about how we're going to get to a 4C target that holds things at 4C. We're not going above 4C. That's not going to happen. So get that mitigation in place. Start to prepare for adaptation. The planet's definitely going to warm. We have no choice. Well, for some reason, I lost that. We have no choice. We have to adapt. What else? The other thing is, it turns out that there are going to be some people that are big losers. So the big losers are the people in the low latitudes and people who happen to be in small islands. They are going to bear the brunt of climate change. So one of the serious questions is, if they're going to take a gigantic hit from climate change, should we actually also think about some kind of a compensation package? You know, if we're very rich and the people that are really getting creamed because we're putting emissions into the atmosphere are very poor, should we in fact try to make their life a little bit better because of what we're doing? So I think another stool or another leg of the stool of climate change policy should be compensation. And then there's one thing that I haven't talked about at all in this, and that is that there is remaining uncertainty. We're making projections about what would happen in 100 years, 200 years. When people ask economists to make long-term projections, they're talking about a 3-year plan. Making a 100-year plan, a 200-year plan, that is way out there. That's not something we're comfortable doing. It's not something that anybody's terribly certain about what's actually going to happen in 100 years from now, 200 years from now. So we'll make a plan today, given the best we know. But one of the things you should be recognized is that, you know, we might not be right. It could be that climate change is not going to be as bad as we thought. That's one of the possibilities. Some of the models say it's actually going to be pretty harmless. If that's the case, we can relax. If we find that out, we can just relax. It's not going to be a big issue. The other possibility is it's going to be worse than we thought. That could happen. That's definitely another thing that's in the possibilities. And so the other thing we might want to have is an emergency program, an insurance program. If things turn out to be worse than we thought, what can we do for an emergency? And it turns out to do that, we want geoengineering as a background. If things are going to go to hell, let's turn on a geoengineering program and make sure that doesn't happen. So we don't want to use geoengineering instead of mitigation. We want geoengineering as an insurance policy in case things run away from us. And they're not what we thought they were. They're much worse. Thank you.
Terrific. Our next speaker is Charlotte Kaiser. She's going to talk about investing in the environment. Charlotte's the Director of Innovative Finance at the Nature Conservancy, which I can't resist pointing out has recently, it has one of the biggest endowments, maybe the biggest of its sort of NGO organization, and it's divested from tar sands and coal. And one hopes perhaps down the road they'll go further. But that's really something to applaud. Anyway, at Nature Conservancy, she develops innovative financing tools to support conservation activities, particularly the conservation note. That's a promissory note of Nature Conservancy. It's a debt instrument that would allow investors to support land conservation by purchasing the Conservancy's corporate debt. They have a AA rating, better than Russia today, by far. So if you're interested, you could talk to Charlotte after the meeting. Before she joined Nature Conservancy, she had a decade of experience in land conservation, financial analysis, urban development, and strategic planning. Most recently, she worked at Citibank in their community development investing, providing debt and equity financing for green buildings affordable housing, and energy efficiency initiatives. And she's also worked for the New York City Parks Department, promoting civic engagement and stewardship of the city's parks and natural areas, and also in Indonesian Borneo on a community-based forest management enterprise. She holds a BA from Harvard in environmental science and a master's in environmental science from Yale and an MBA from Yale School of Management. So, Charlotte, welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. Is it still morning? It's still morning. Great. So I'm going to change gears a little bit from the previous talks and talk about sort of how we can start to think about investing our capital in the environment. Professor Mendelsohn, who was my professor at Yale, talked about the value of natural capital and ecosystems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Nature Conservancy is working to capture that value into investment products to support conservation. So here we are with the Nature Conservancy. I wouldn't describe us, by the way, as being part of the environmental left. Hank Paulson was the chair of our board for a number of years. I think what we're trying to do is transactions that protect the lands and waters on which all life depends, ours as well as that of the non-human species on the planet. And what we do is try to act at big scale. We're a $6 billion organization. We have a AA rating from Moody's and Standard & Poor's, whatever that's worth these days. And we try to do things in ways that sort of have large-scale impact. So we started 60 some odd years ago here in New York State buying a small piece of land in Westchester County. And we have moved beyond that to thinking about the whole systems that function across the globe and how people and nature can support one another and interact and thrive going forward in a climate-changing world. So on the left, those are some Samburu cattle herders, and we're working with them to improve the rangelands grazing practices that they have with their cattle. In a way that supports both improved cattle productivity and improved wildlife habitat, and they get more money for the cows when they sell them. So it's a good example of how we're trying to optimize productivity for humans and nature, if you think of those as separate. And then on the right, you've got an example of the kinds of whole systems in which we're working. So the whole Mississippi River Basin, the whole Canadian boreal forest. And to think about whole systems requires whole system thinking and requires thinking about not just the money that you give philanthropically. Although we're a nonprofit, we're a charity, we raise a lot of money philanthropically in $35 checks and in $26 million gifts. But we also need to think about where the real money comes from, which is investment capital. So Professor Mendelsohn talked about a multi-trillion-dollar investment need for keeping the planet at 4 degrees. There's other estimates that suggest that on an annual basis to preserve functioning ecosystems globally, that's a $300 billion annual need. I'm not going to do a net present value calculation of that because I can't. But if you look at what's being spent today, it's 20% of that, right? It's about $50 billion, of which most is public and charitable, and about $10 billion is in the form of private investment. So if you think about, you could maybe potentially double that public and charitable investment in conservation. You'd get to 80 to 100 billion. You've still got a substantial gap in terms of what's needed to invest in nature to preserve its function for us, for the plants and animals that depend on it, for our livelihoods, for our way of living. So how do we get there? And the answer is really through private capital. So on your left, you have our fundraising as an institution. We're very good at it. We raise about $400 million a year. But we're not going very far in terms of growth, in terms of raising philanthropic capital and public funding. On the right, you have the growth rate of what's being called today impact investing. And I know Christina's going to talk about this too. But this is the idea that if you're really trying to change the world and you're giving away 5% of your wealth every year, you're not really playing with all the cards in your deck, right? There's 95% of your capital that's sitting on the sidelines and is not working to change the world. And it could be. You could be investing for impact as well as for a financial return. And you could be divesting for impact, like the Nature Conservancy has begun to do and lots of other institutions have begun to do, not including Harvard, unfortunately. So we've got conservation funding has been flat, but you see a huge growth in the formation of impact investment funds, and most of them in the last 3 or 4 years. The question is, what can we do as a public charity, as a nonprofit institution, that to try to identify and capture the value that's created by conservation of natural systems and create investment opportunities from that value? So you can think of a spectrum of returns and a spectrum of products that align with those returns that we can participate in and achieve impact and some return on investment. So all the way over on the right, you have no return. You leave your capital in the ground for maximum impact. You write to create a national park probably doesn't generate a return on investment. To take a dam out of a river to improve the natural flows for salmon and other spawning fish doesn't really generate a return on investment because nobody's paying. There's that the beneficiaries, the salmon, don't pay us for that, right? On the other hand, to invest all the way over on the left, to invest in a green real estate development or a solar energy facility creates a market rate of return and also achieves some kind of positive impact on the environment. And then in the middle is a lot of interesting stuff. And that's where we're trying to grow our work, to create opportunities to invest for maybe not totally market rate competitive returns, but really high impact. And the thought is that you might be willing to trade some portion of your return in some portion of your portfolio against achieving significant impact for the world. So we just got a really interesting gift for our Africa program, $26 million, of which 19 is philanthropy, to pay our staff to build schools for communities, to help to do elephant conservation work, pay guards, that kind of thing. And then 7 million of it is a concessionary loan into what we call our Livestock to Markets program, which is the program I described earlier about helping the Samburu do better grazing on their land in exchange for us buying their cows at more than they would otherwise get. So the communities make money, the wildlife are better off, our investor makes a return, and we scale from operating in a very small area of a few 100,000 acres to well over 1.5 million acres of improved grazelands. So there's a bunch of options in this middle range: program-related investing, which is foundations investing a portion of their endowment in a way that aligns with their mission and counts towards their annual distribution of grants every year; socially responsible investing; impact investing. And we've worked with investors for years. We bought a huge tract of land in the Adirondacks 5 or 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, which included, refinancing the distressed debt of this timber company into a lower interest rate loan. We're working in Patagonia, with Patagonia in Patagonia, to create sustainable wool, improved grazing of sheep, reduces impact on the environment. Patagonia is buying the wool from those sheep and putting it into their products. We've bought a lot of fishing licenses over the years. This is in California. We've leased them back to fishermen under improved management practices. We're generating a return on investment from those lease payments. But we have a really big opportunity to expand, and we are launching actually next week a program with the founding support of J.P. Morgan Chase, which is not necessarily a typical partner for a conservation organization, but it's our view that you go where the money is to have the most impact that you possibly can, to create investments and deals that allow for people to invest in the sustainable management of natural resources, generate a return on investment, and stop thinking about nature as just a nice-to-have charity case and thinking about it as an asset of capital that we all need to invest in to protect. So Bevis mentioned the conservation note. So this was our first effort to try to create opportunities to invest in nature, and it basically took advantage of our healthy balance sheet and our credit rating and asked people if they wanted to lend us money instead of or as well as giving it to us. And it turns out people do. We've raised, we've gotten over $25 million invested through this product in the last 2 years. There's really substantial demand for this kind of product that allows you to put in your portfolio, you know, a way to support conservation as well as earn a return. So you've got a 1, 3, or 5 year note. You earn a particular rate of return on it, and it's guaranteed by us. And we use it to do land conservation primarily and other things. We're working with individual investors who are thinking about this in a very large scale. We've got one impact investor who's going to lend us, who's going to establish an operating foundation, and all of the assets of that foundation are going to be invested in conservation. So the return, sustainable timber rather. So you've got a 1 or 2% return over 10 to 15 years, so pretty low, but your capital is preserved, and you're able to achieve, you know, large-scale whole system conservation. We're putting in 10% of the money. This investor is putting in 90%, and then we'll be selling it at the end, and that'll recoup our capital. Here's the Africa program I mentioned. So you've got, you've got these Samburu. They're grazing their cattle. Ordinarily, they would have to trek their cows dozens of miles to a middleman. The cows lose lots of weight on the walk. The middleman pays them whatever he wants. The person's not exactly going to not take the deal and walk back with these skinny cows. So they're stuck. And then the middleman doesn't get that great a deal either, as he walks the cows into Nairobi and sells it into the meat market. What we do is we work with these communities to improve their grazing practices. We buy the cows. We then take the cows and fatten them on grasslands that are nearby, and that's an additional area of improved grazing, additional area of improved wildlife habitat. The cows get into better shape. We're able to slaughter them there on site at their higher grade of beef than would be otherwise sold into the market, and so we capture that value and return it to the communities. In the small island developing states that are going to be hit hardest by climate change, we're working to purchase sovereign debt at a discount and swap it into a payment stream for climate adaptation and mitigation, including marine conservation, improved fisheries management, coral reef and mangrove restoration. And we've got close to $1 billion of pipeline in terms of nations lined up to try to do these investments with us. The first couple deals will be Belize with $25 million, creating a $25 million investment plus $25 million in grants. We'll create a $100 million trust fund for marine conservation. And in the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, where we're creating a $50 million trust fund from $15 million of investment and $7 million in philanthropy. So there's always going to be a role for philanthropy in the work that we do. I think our goal here is to create opportunities that the market can't find today. It's not necessarily obvious that you could work with Samburu cattle herders and generate, a single-digit rate of return over 5 to 7 years. But we have those relationships and we have that track record, and our goal here is to take that $7 million investment that our donor made into that program and refinance it into a commercial bank loan at the end of 5 years. So the goal here is to identify the opportunities that aren't necessarily obvious to the marketplace and make them market ready, make them market obvious. And that's the partnership we have, or the relationship we have with JP Morgan. They're helping us think about investment structures and opportunities that can be scaled into a traditional commercial investment. So we're very excited about this. I think if you think about the future of environmental conservation, if you look back over the 60 years that we've been in existence as an institution, it's moved from, wow, there's a lot of human activity, and then there are these nice places that we're going to protect forever. We're going to put up a fence. We're going to prevent you from going there. We're going to let you go as a tourist. It's moved from that to realizing that that's not a sustainable path. We can't fence off all the good stuff because we're using it. We're living on it. It's part of our lives. It's part of it helps us with, it creates fresh water for us. It's a source of food for us. It's where we grow our crops. It's where we graze our animals. How do you how do you operate sustainably in that framework in the places that we're on the planet that we're using and living off of? And I think the investment opportunities that we're trying to create are really going to help drive that sustainability. So lots of ideas in terms of our pipeline. Right now, I've mentioned all the ones that we're working on here. We've got, in addition to the ones I've already talked about, a similar cattle program in Colombia that intensifies the productivity of cattle ranching, which is going to reduce deforestation in the Amazon, triples the yields on the meat or the milk, basically by planting trees and rotating the grazing of the cows. But there again, you have to talk to every farmer. You have to change the behavior of a whole bunch of cattle ranchers, which is hard if you know anything about cattle ranchers. And that's the kind of role that a charity, that a public nonprofit can play, is do that product development, do that long-term relationship management and relationship building, and eventually, demonstrate the track record and the impact and create the investment opportunity. Looking forward, we're looking at water markets in Australia. We're thinking about how do you get cities to invest in climate adaptation and source water protection and stormwater runoff management using green infrastructure as much as possible, using natural systems. How do you optimize the existing mitigation and environmental credit trading programs to achieve maximum conservation impact? And what's the size of the opportunity in terms of managing fishing rights and ecotourism? So I can keep going. We have lots of ideas. But I think I will stop.
So our fourth speaker is Christina Leijonhufvud, which is easier to say in English. It means lion's head. And Christina said I could disclose that to you because I would botch up the Swedish pronunciation of her name, which I just did. Christina's a co-founder and managing partner of Tideline Advisors. That's a consulting firm specializing in impact investments and strategic philanthropy. Tideline's founders have extensive experience in traditional financial services, bringing practicality and discipline to the innovative field of impact investing, which we've just learned about. Christina combines extensive experience in risk management, international development, and emerging markets with her passion for social entrepreneurship and impact investment. She was a managing director at J.P. Morgan, where she created and led the firm's social finance strategy from 2007 to 2012, after serving 10 years in senior risk management roles. She received an MSc in economics from the London School of Economics and an MA in International Affairs from George Washington University, and her BA in Sociology from UCLA. So please welcome Christina to speak to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to give a talk that's somewhat of an extension of Charlotte's piece. I'd like to speak about the role of financial markets in solving the climate crisis. But before I do so, I'd just like to make a call out for my co-author and co-conspirator, Dr. Fitz, who's in the front section of the room here. And I'm doing that because he's the real expert. And any difficult questions I'll be sending his way. I'm simply a recovering banker interested in the issues of climate change. So the global private investment industry controls at least $100 trillion of capital. It clearly plays an important part in both the problem and the solution to climate change. In order to unlock the much greater amounts of private capital we need, we're going to need extensive behavioral systemic change. We're going to need coordinated action by citizens, investors, investment firms and advisors, politicians, regulators, and nonprofits. Some positive developments are underway, notably in the market for clean energy investments and impact investments, but much remains to be done. So I'm going to start with the problem, and I'd like to take a look at some of the basic climate arithmetic that many of you have probably seen that have been provided by Carbon Tracker, an organization in the UK, along with the London School of Economics. So in 2010, governments agreed in Cancun that emissions should be reduced to a level that limits global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. I'm not going to get into the debate on whether 2 degrees is practical or feasible, because it's not important for the implications of this analysis. The point is, for an 80% chance of keeping to that limit, CO2 emissions from now until 2050 cannot exceed 900 gigatons of carbon. This is what we're calling the so-called carbon budget. At the same time, the total carbon embedded in the world's known fossil fuel reserves amount to 2,860 gigatons of carbon, over 3 times the so-called carbon budget, implying that only approximately 30% of those reserves can actually be burned, leaving the remaining what's being called stranded or unburnable. So because I'm talking about the financial market's role, I'd like to take a look at those fossil fuel companies that are actually listed on global stock exchanges. They own approximately 1/4 of all known or proven reserves, or about 762 gigatons of carbon. Since we know that 70% of all known fossil fuel reserves will have to be left in the ground if we're going to have a hope of meeting the 2 degrees Celsius target, then listed fossil fuel companies can only burn 30%, or approximately 225 gigatons of their known reserves. And that is represented by the pink circle inside the bigger burgundy circle of known reserves. You can see that for other temperature targets, the implications are actually not that different. Now, financial markets place a value on the outstanding equity and debt of the top 200 listed fossil fuel companies of approximately $4 trillion and $1.5 trillion, respectively. Implicit in these valuations is the assumption that these companies are not only going to burn through their proven reserves, but are going to go on to continue to invest in developing new reserves. If we include the interest in undeveloped fossil fuel reserves, the embedded carbon number doubles to over 1,500 gigatons of carbon, nearly 7 times their share of the carbon budget. And by one estimate, the global industry spends about $1.8 billion a day on exploring for new reserves. The point of all this math is that if 70% of listed fossil fuel reserves is unburnable, and make it 50% or lower if you'd like, these companies are greatly overvalued by the financial markets. This is what's being called a carbon bubble, not unlike the property market bubble that we've recently experienced in the earlier part of this last decade. In fact, HSBC, a global financial institution, has estimated that valuations could drop as much as 40 to 60% in a low emission scenario. Clearly, the financial markets are not pricing in the possibility of a solution to our climate crisis. The real importance of this simple arithmetic is that it helps take us beyond the moral argument, which more often alienates investor types than appeals to them, and makes a real financial case for reconsidering investments in fossil fuels. The divestment movement, which has gained a lot of media attention in recent months, is running with this data and gaining remarkable traction in a short period of time. Not since the anti-apartheid movement have we seen so many university students around the country, around the world, organize around a divestment theme. So far, 18 foundations, 27 religious institutions, 22 cities, and 11 colleges and universities have committed to divest. Admittedly, the number of dollars moved is tiny compared to the market capitalization of the fossil fuel companies. but it's just the beginning. Moreover, the real power of this campaign depends on its ability to more broadly shift public opinion and social values around fossil fuels. The divestment movement also coincides with some of the important trends that Charlotte mentioned, notably in the market, the clean energy investment movement and the emerging field of impact investments, which are investments made with the intention of both positive social and environmental return and financial return. I'm going to skip over some of the more technical features, which I think Dr. Mendelsohn actually focused on. This is a passing reference to a seminal paper in 2004 by Pakala and Sokolow, who argued that the technologies for carbon mitigation are already largely available, as Dr. Mendelsohn pointed out earlier. We need not wait around for a revolutionary technology. With that backdrop in mind, we actually see a robust market for clean energy investments growing across geographies and financial markets. This chart provides new equity investment data, and you can see for the last 4 years globally, the numbers have been over 200 billion per annum. In fact, Citibank even recently declared this the beginning of the age of renewables in the United States, pointing to the growing cost competitiveness of solar and to a lesser extent wind with natural gas. We also see in this chart the numbers by sector. Solar has clearly outpaced other renewable subsectors in terms of its receipt of investment dollars, with wind promising to gain a growing share. We all know that China has, I think, taken the leading role in emissions of carbon dioxide in the world, having replaced the United States a couple of years ago. But what was surprising to me was China actually leads the race for clean energy in terms of, at least in terms of absolute dollar investment numbers. This is a result of the Chinese government's target to reduce carbon emissions by 40% by 2020, which was included in their last 5-year plan. I'm realizing I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip some of our slides. Okay. So the numbers I provided here relate to equity market data. One thing I'd like to mention is there's also a market in the bond markets for green or climate-friendly bonds, which is of growing interest to investors. So we see climate-themed bonds outstanding now at about $350 billion, according to the Climate Bond Initiative. And again, China is leading the market for issuance of green bonds. Despite this positive news and rapid growth of the renewables market over the last decades, the share of fossil fuels in global power production remains where it was 25 years ago, or roughly at 82% of total power production. The International Energy Agency estimates that renewable energy generation needs to double by 2020 if we're going to meet our goals of halving carbon emissions by the middle of this century. And investment in clean sources of energy still falls far short of what is needed. In the 10 years that I've been actively participating in the impact investing movement, one thing I must say that has concerned me is the lack of connection or integration between the markets for clean energy and the impact investment movement, where impact investors are often motivated primarily by issues of poverty and don't seem to have the tools or the language to talk or relate to their colleagues in the clean energy investment market. Collaboration across these two movements is growing, as Charlotte pointed out, but we still need more focus on this inextricable link between solving our world's energy problems and addressing the needs of the world's poor. Moving to a clean energy economy cannot come at the expense of the growing energy needs of people emerging from poverty throughout the world. As many as 1.3 billion people in the world still lack access to electricity. And as economic growth picks up in developing countries, it is critical that investment is channeled to energy solutions that helps these countries leapfrog old and carbon-intensive technologies. And as Dr. Mendelsohn pointed out, that requires significant amounts of capital. Which leads us to the broader question of how can we trust the financial system to steward capital toward environmental and social good? And unfortunately, the answer is we can't, certainly not without outright pressure from clients and regulators, which leads me back to the impact investment market. It turns out that this new investment movement has been gathering pace over the last decade. It's really seeking a new approach to investment. It's one that's seeking both positive environmental and social impact, as well as financial return. If we think about capital as lying on a spectrum between mainstream investments that target financial returns only or look to maximize financial returns, and on the other end of the spectrum, philanthropy, which looks at impact only and looks to give money away for social purpose, impact investments lie somewhere in between those two. And it's an investment movement that's really growing. It's expected to grow to approximately $500 billion by the end of this decade. But it still sits largely on the fringes of the mainstream market. It's driven heavily by high net worth individuals, boutique investment funds, and intermediaries. So there's a number of obstacles that we're going to need to overcome to help channel larger institutional scale capital to impact investments. One of them is really related to the skepticism in mainstream financial institutions regarding the feasibility, actually, of blending environmental and social goals and financial goals. Others relate to the short-term mindset, which is very ingrained in the markets due to quarterly performance reporting and benchmarking. Benchmarking itself is a significant problem. Investment managers care more about their relative returns, their returns relative to a benchmark, than they do about their absolute performance, because they're paid based on relative returns. And the interpretations of fiduciary duty by institutional investors are quite limited and narrow. These obstacles are daunting, but I'd like to conclude on a more positive note. I think we're beginning to see the seeds of change. There are connections and common goals emerging across the divestment, the clean energy, and the impact investing movements. These communities have more in common than you might think, and together they may have the power to bring investment industry to bear in helping solve our climate crisis. Thank you.